secure terms of employment lead to counterproductive workplace behaviors. So the last example that we show in the paper is called Rivethead, which is a really funny story as well if you ever had a chance to read it. It was probably my favorite out of all the ones that I read. And basically it's about a gentleman who works for GM. He's on the assembly line. And it's sort of a monotonous job. You get the idea through the story that it's not very interesting. And so they invent these different games to make the time pass a little bit more easily. And so they play rivet hockey, they do what they call doubling up, which is when one person does the job of two people, and one can relax or drink or smoke or do things like that. And it's interesting in the story because the manager that they had during all these different kinds of actions said, you know, as long as you get your work done, that's fine. Just get the work done, meet the quota, do whatever you want to do other than that. Well, they have a change in management, and you see someone come in who's much more by the book. No, we're not going to do anything except for what we were told to do, etc. And this lasts for maybe a day or two, and then all of a sudden you see broken parts coming down the line, you see guns being broken, like nail guns, things that they've used, and there's this reaction to their autonomy being taken away. And so you have a really interesting relationship between counterproductive workplace behaviors and autonomy, looking at the conditions of secure terms of employment and safe and healthy working conditions. So it was a fun project to be a part of. And the QCA, one thing I really was interested in learning with QCA was it's very contextual. So you're not looking at how to control for certain things to highlight or pinpoint a certain mechanism. You're looking at mechanisms within a specific context or organization or culture. And the idea is that the condition is wrapped up in whatever kind of culture or context they're in. So you can't really separate it. It's a much more holistic approach. So that was one of the reasons that I really enjoyed QCA. And I think the learning outcome I have from all of this is especially the more intimate you become with the data, the more you see in it. And hopefully see stuff that's actually there, not something you're just assuming or hoping is there, but something that really is there. So if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer some questions afterwards. At the moment, I'm going to hand it back over to Dr. Lucas.
All right, so this brings us to the concluding slide, which is where we are now along this path. And I like this image. I think it's a great representation of qualitative research because being a qualitative researcher is a long and circuitous path. It is certainly not the quickest path from point A to point B, and that means that you have to get comfortable with the long haul. You have to get comfortable with really long data collections that might take weeks or months or even sometimes years to complete. With qualitative data analyses where you're just raking through piles and piles of qualitative data, sometimes thousands of documents to reach your conclusions. What I think is also interesting about this is that we see some fellow travelers along the path, but it is not a jam-packed superhighway that you would have with quantitative research, the fastest way from point A to point B. There's fewer people on this path. So if you are going into a faculty position or continuing into a faculty position on a qualitative path, you have to realize that you're going to be alone much of the time. Your colleagues may not be joining you. They may not understand where you're going. So it's important to be kind to your fellow travelers, to look out, put signposts out, to help other people find their way, to look for other signposts that people have left, to welcome people into your journey, like I've recruited Cole, partially into my journey, because it is a long process. So that's why groups like this are also really important, because you need to identify who those fellow travelers are. But the path is an interesting one, and I think it's one that that's very worthwhile to follow. It's enabled me to carve out a very specific research agenda. No, there's not 20 articles or 30 articles that I've written on this topic over the years. They've been slow, they've been a couple years apart. But I think that it's made important incremental contributions to understanding workplace dignity. I think that it's also helped me sharpen my skills analytically and as a writer, and it's established for me really interesting and positive collaborative research relationships with others. So, with that, we'd like to open up for questions.
I think you could give her a qualitative round. Okay, one of the questions that I was very curious about is when we set up this talk and we were so excited to have Dr. Lucas and Cole as well as a part of the team was, but how do you have these graduate student faculty partnerships and how do you make that work? And what is your experience? Like, what do you see are some benefits and some challenges to trying to fit working with research projects and coursework and everything?
Well, for me, it's been all benefits. I think qualitative is really interesting as far as just a whole methodology. It really incorporates the story and the context, which I find extremely interesting looking at data. So I've really enjoyed learning qualitative methods. I really think it's been all benefits. I can't think of one thing that Dr. Lucas has been extremely kind with is trying to find my interests and where they overlap with hers. And so the dignity piece is really interesting. The entrepreneurial passion piece was great because that's right in line with
That's
what
another
we're
study
saying.
that we just.
Yeah, it's another paper. And so she's been very gracious in finding those overlaps with me. So it's been really easy in that regard, especially. But I'm not sure if that really helps.
Yeah, that does help because I know we have a bit of a mix of students, faculty in the room, so that's helpful.
I was curious, about the fuzzy set analysis. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I'm sorry, I didn't do a very good job explaining. So the whole idea, more broadly or more specifically, what are you
More specifically, I'm not very familiar with it, so
Okay.
as if I weren't familiar with it,
Yeah,
tell me about your experience with it.
So the idea is to find specific cause and effect relationships. And one thing I really like about fuzzy set is it doesn't assume there's just one cause for a specific outcome, or even if you think of an outcome being D, A plus B plus C equals D. They have this thing called complex conjunctural causality, and with the idea of you can derive an outcome multiple ways. So you could go through one path to get to the outcome, or through another path to get to the outcome. And it can depend on the context, it can depend on the structure, various things to get to that outcome. And so what QCA tries to do is pinpoint those relationships that get to the specific outcome, if that sort of makes sense. So they call them recipes, which I mean, that works well, I guess, but there are multiple recipes to arrive at a specific. Does it sort of?
Can I add a little bit to it?
Yeah.
So it requires, first step, identifying and coding in a real simplified way different variables across qualitative cases. So if you have, what department are you in?
I'm in the College of Education and Higher Ed.
Okay, so if you have, for example, cases with different schools and you wanted to look at student outcomes, you would have your 20 schools or 100 schools, and then you might have coding on teacher empowerment, whatever the variables are that you're looking at or things that you might contribute, which could be coded anywhere from 0 to 1. And then you would apply this Boolean algebra to it, and it would kind of show you which combinations of those variables predict student learning, right? Yeah. So it's a good way to seek those patterns in otherwise unwieldy cases.
So would you then suggest that those patterns need to be like too exhaustive, or or how do you? So each path. So going back to in a way to coding, or when you say you recognize these patterns. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, very much. So, a couple of things. One is the assumption with QC is you're really intimate with the data. You know the data really, really well. You know the cases well, which is important because you're trying to identify these relationships within specific contexts. Second, the analysis you do, there's a specific software for it that you can find. It's in the handout. And you create basically these truth tables. And that helps with identifying the patterns because you do these crosstabs and it shows percentages. There's two, well, I don't know if it's the board, but there's two basic scores that you come up with, consistency and coverage. And consistency is the presence of the cause and the outcome over the cause without, the cases of the cause without the outcome. So you're doing these two scores, which helps you identify the specific patterns of relationships across cases.
And basically, I'm guessing that you need to have at least 80, but preferably 90%.
Yes, for consistency score especially, you need to really, so there's kind of a whole discussion on what the score needs to be. Olson and Weiss would recommend a 0.9 threshold would be ideal. Anything over 0.9, you're pretty much, you can make the argument for over 0.8, but then you're kind of in a gray area.
So is, in entrepreneurship specifically, a couple of schools, is qualitative research very widely done?
Not widely done, more so in the UK. There's a lady, her name is, I think it's a white lady, who does a lot of qualitative research in entrepreneurship. And then Carton, who did a whole passion scale stuff, that's an AMJ paper, or her theory of animal pattern. She did some, she's done qualitative research in entrepreneurship.
Her
Right.
coworker.
Right, the one she's published with.
Midness.
Yeah. But Carton basically created an entrepreneurial passion scale and then has subsequently tested it, and she's a qualitative. But it's not widely done, but it's becoming more prevalent.
But so it's something that you can see yourself doing in the future.
Absolutely. And I think, I really enjoy qualitative. I also like mixed methods, so I see kind of a combination of analyses.
So it's really wonderful. I'm sorry, I had a done the meeting. I got here late. I will look into your research. It's very interesting to me. I'm in the College of Education, Human Development, and qualitative researcher, and serving as the dean right now. Very important, I think, for our junior faculty and our doctoral students to understand the spectrum of research methodology, how important qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods studies are, and that really solid, high quality, qualitative research can absolutely stand on its own and be very impactful, not generalizable, which quantitative
But
people tend to
transferable.
want.
I'm just having this
Exactly.
conversation now, where we have to go.
Yeah, exactly. So what's your advice to junior faculty or doctoral students who may be told, well, you better get on a research team with mixed methods scholars or quantitative scholars because it's going to be hard for you to get promoted and tenured, or you're not going to get funding. I mean, those are things that those of us in the field hear a lot. Can you speak to that and how you mentor folks, or how you will continue to help us promote the importance of the spectrum?
And I mean, and that's, well, I think probably the most important thing would be, if this is what you're passionate about, you have to find a place that supports you doing that kind of research. Preferably a place that has a senior scholar in a relative position of power who understands and appreciates and probably is a qualitative scholar him or herself. Because without that support in place, your research is going to be judged by quantitative standards. So they're going to look at the superhighway jam-packed with cars, 8 people on an article, and say, well, your colleague did 14 articles last year for, depending on what institution you're at. Your colleague did 4 or 5 articles last year, and you did 1? You're not being very productive without realizing that your data collection was not a survey that you set up, but it was one-on-one interviews that you spent 90 hours driving to, conducting the interviews, and coming back, that you then did about 200 hours transcribing and verifying those transcripts, that you then went through each one and you did another 800 hours of coding, right? And so if there's not somebody who recognizes that, that's going to be difficult. It's also, you mentioned generalizable, right? And so I was just in a meeting with a colleague of mine who is not experienced in qualitative, who called me in and then said, but what's the hypothesis and how do you test the hypothesis? So you need to get confident in yourself and what it means to be a good qualitative researcher, because you need to be able to have those conversations where you say, we're not talking about generalizability, we're talking about transferability. And we're not talking about an absolute arbitrary number of whatever in terms of data collection, but we're talking about theoretical saturation. And you need to be able to define those and explain those and be confident in that. So yeah, finding support and being confident in yourself.
Thank you.
To add a comment to that, I also think it also depends on your discipline and also sometimes even which college you belong to in terms of how welcoming folks are or open about these different methodologies.
Right. Yeah, I went to, so I belong to the Academy of Management. I went to a pre-conference workshop on qualitative research, and they said you need to negotiate, and I don't think you can do this unless you have that great advocate in the department you're entering, but you need to negotiate up front that your numbers are going to look different than quantitative researchers' numbers, that you're going to have different kinds of support for research. Yeah.
That's great. I have another question. It's kind of very in the minutia, so I
Oh, yeah.
But you mentioned transcribing and also checking your transcribing. So when you do that, what's the sort of feedback that you get from your participants, and what is the process by which you transcribe? Do you transcribe every single thing that they say, or do you try to capture the salient points? Because I've had some feedback where they're like, I said too much and so this feels inaccurate or something.
Right, so I don't have them check their transcripts.
Oh, you don't?
I check their transcripts. So one of the things that will happen is as I'm transcribing, or if I shop it out to a professional transcriptionist, is sometimes some of the words will get messed up, or a not will be added or omitted where it shouldn't be, right? So I will do another playback with a careful read on that transcript. One of the things that you asked is how carefully I transcribe. I am not a super careful transcriber in the sense that if somebody stutters on a word, I'm not going to capture the stutter. And if somebody speaks in ways that they are dropping the G on the ing, I'm singing, I'm not going to use stylized spellings. I will, with I will, if it's I might leave that out. If they give me a big long, here's my answer, then I'm going to include that. But if it just sounds like a disfluency, I leave that out. Sometimes I do interviews in coffee shops, and so sometimes we stop and talk to the waitress and say, yes, I would like a refill. I leave that out. So I kind of get more to the words that are said without all of the disfluency. And the reason why I do that is because for my purposes, I'm more interested in meaning than conversation analysis. If I was more of a conversation analysis type of analyst, qualitative analyst, I would do much more micro-level transcriptions. But I also wouldn't have 60 to 100 hours of interviews to transcribe either.
And so what's the rationale behind not sharing the transcript with the participant?
Nobody has ever asked me for them. There was one study that I did where I was interviewing old-timers who were underground iron ore miners, and they're transcripts had some historical value to them. Those I transcribed and bound and gave as a gift and as for something for their family to hold on to. Right?
I guess the larger question is, how do you do member checking? So if
Oh, how am I doing member checking? I don't always member check. I know that some people like member checking, and I think in some cases member checking is important. Some of the research that I've done, it hasn't really been, I have felt that I've gotten to my results without having to do member checking. I think that in cases, if there were doubts about how I was interpreting something, I think that that would be a time that I would go back, but so far, at least the studies that I have done, maybe I should be doing more member checking, but I just haven't really done a whole lot of that.
And you have your audio.
And I have my audio, right? I am really careful in terms of how I present the data as well, in terms of identity of the people participating. So sometimes I will change quotes a little bit if I feel they're revealing identifying information. So for example, one of the studies was interviewing people from my hometown. And there was somebody who revealed, and then I went to Montana to visit my aunt. And I thought, ooh, going to Montana to visit your aunt, that might be identifiable. So that got taken out. So we went out of town to visit family. Right? And so like sometimes if it's not substantively changing things but obscuring some private detail, so I will do that a little bit. But I have had, and maybe this is why I feel okay for not doing the member checks, but again, you're making me feel like I should, is I've had other people come and read my work without knowing who, so it's not going back to exact members, but it's going back to other people in the community who have said, this is so right on. So one of my best compliments ever in terms of scholarly work is my master's thesis. My grandmother kept a copy. This was the one where I interviewed the old timers. And guys with 8th grade and 10th grade educations went to her house and checked it out. She had like a library card in it and read it. And they said, oh, it's exactly right. She knew, just like out of the horse's mouth. And so I thought, oh, you know, doesn't get much better than that.
And I should admit, I'm a doctoral candidate, so I have a lot of very logistical questions.
Okay. Like, how do I do
That's
this?
good you have some
How
specific
far
questions.
along are you in data collection?
I haven't started collecting them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, those transcriptions can take forever. Use Express Scribe if you're going to do it yourself.
Okay.
Do you have a qualitative data analysis software?
I use in vivo.
Okay. I threw away in vivo in 2006. Yes. What do you use?
This is specifically on workplace dignity, I
uh-huh.
guess, but do you have any experience in educational dignity? How people who may have had some unfortunate experiences may affect their educational uptake, if you will, and how those things might be mitigated in a classroom?
So can you tell me a little bit more of what, are you talking
So
about
I
from a
guess like the
student
question,
perspective,
yeah,
teacher
just
perspective?
student perspective, say a student has, bad experiences in school, being, looked down on,
Mhm.
hurt emotionally, even physically in the learning environment.
Mhm.
I guess kind of the question is how might that translate to the
Hmm.
effectiveness in learning?
Mhm.
And is there perhaps a way that these questions could be asked on an individual basis to help them learn?
Yeah. Well, I think number one, they absolutely can be asked. I haven't done it. I'm kind of going through my storehouse of, my mental Rolodex of articles, and I'm not sure of anybody who's looked at dignity. Well, and specifically, I look at workplace dignity. So I'm excluding things that are happening outside work context. So I think it's quite possible that there could be people studying dignity in education experiences, and these women around you are probably excellent sources to point you to that, since they're all in education, the College of Education. But what I would say is that my research says that people want three things. They want to be talked to respectfully, they want to be told when they've done a good job, and that they want their inequalities downplayed as much as possible. And so I think that would apply to students too. Like, I can't imagine how that wouldn't apply. And what Cole in my study found is that when people have less dignity, well, let me say, when they have more dignity, they are more likely to be engaged in their work, so engaged in learning. And they're also, when they have more dignity, they're less likely, for the most part, to engage in counterproductive work behaviors or misbehavior. So again, if you apply that, if that translated to a school, you'd have more engaged students, less misbehavior, if they were talked to respectfully, complimented and appreciated for their competence, and inequalities downplayed. It makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I thought it was interesting when you talked first about your study with, the companies that were making, the Apple and those organizations, and you talked about workplace dignity in that context, and then when you looked at LGBTQ, folks who were talking about those experiences, especially when you talked about instrumentality and inequality. In a sense, I found similar patterns emerging in how you can see the connections between the experiences seem to be, the patterns of experience, especially when you have your dignity violated, depending on your identity in one way, in how you identify yourself as a person, versus, and in addition to what you bring to the workplace, and in the cultures of the workplace, and also can add or exploit or violate dignity in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, you're kind of tapping into these two fundamental philosophical bases of dignity. So dignity from a philosophical standpoint would say, one, that everybody has an inherent equal human value. So just for the sake of being a human being, you have equal value to anybody else. But then there's sort of this earned dignity, so coming from this basis of dignity as sort of a badge of honor, something reserved for dignitaries, right? People with more dignity than others. That there should be opportunities in a workplace, even though it's instrumental, right, and unequal, to earn all of the dignity and worth that you have the capacity to earn, right? And so in that case, it's unequal, presumably equitable, but an unequal dignity. So those two, earned and inherent dignities, kind of fight in the workplace context.
That's really active.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm working on a piece right now on social class differences, and it's a conceptual piece, but how social class differences plays out with two paths of dignity injury. So we have these material inequalities in organizations that disproportionately disadvantage working class people, and when they fall, those distributions fall below a dignity threshold, there's a direct violation of their dignity. But together, even when inequalities don't fall below thresholds, even when they meet or exceed basic thresholds, they collectively create a social class identity, which is then disparaged in the way we interact with each other in organizations, the way we put up firewalls to separate people from different classes, or faculty from staff, or whatever the case may be, that creates a different, more indirect path to dignity injury. I shared this with one of our staff members who asked me to read it, and he keeps telling me that's the best thing, I keep a copy on my desk. So.
That would be interesting to study between faculty members and graduate students. Just what that experience is like, especially if you've been an employee elsewhere and then you come back and you're a graduate student, what that experience is
Right.
like.
Yeah, and I think that there's differences even in generations and generational expectations of what is dignified and respectful treatment, or